Having reduced the society to squalor, the Federal Reserve bankers decided that the gold standard should be removed. In order to do this, they needed to acquire the remaining gold in the system. So, under the pretense of helping to end the Depression, came the 1933 gold seizure. Under the threat of imprisonment for 10 years, everyone in America was required to turn in all gold bullion to the Treasury, essentially robbing the public of what little wealth they had left. And at the end of 1933, the gold standard was abolished. If you look at a dollar bill from before 1933, it says it is redeemable in gold. You look at a dollar bill today, it says it is legal tender, which means it is backed by absolutely nothing. It is worthless paper. The only thing that gives our money value is how much of it is in circulation. Therefore, the power to regulate the money supply is also the power to regulate its value, which is also the power to bring entire economies and societies to its knees. It's important to clearly understand, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. It is about as Federal Express. It makes its own policies and is under virtually no regulation by the U.S. government. It is a private bank that loans all the currency at interest to the government, completely consistent with the fraudulent central banking model that the country sought to escape from when it declared independence in the American Revolutionary War. Now, going back to 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was not the only unconstitutional bill pushed through Congress. They also pushed the federal income tax. It's worthwhile to point out that the American public's ignorance towards the federal income tax is a testament to how dumbed down and oblivious the American population really is. First of all, the federal income tax is completely unconstitutional, as it is a direct, unapportioned tax. All direct taxes have to be apportioned to be legal based on the Constitution. Secondly, the required number of states in order to ratify the amendment to allow the income tax was never met, and this has even been cited in modern court cases. Third, at the present day, roughly 25% of the average worker's income is taken via this tax. And guess where that money goes? It goes to pay the interest on the currency being produced by the fraudulent Federal Reserve Bank, a system that does not have to exist at all. The money you make working almost 3 months out of the year goes almost literally into the pockets of the international bankers who own the private Federal Reserve Bank. And fourth, even with the fraudulent government claim as to the legality of the income tax, there is literally no statute, no law in existence that requires you to pay this tax, period.
I really expected that, of course, there's a law that you can point to in the law book, the code, that requires you to file a tax return. Of course there is. I was at that point where I couldn't find the statute that clearly made a person liable. At least not me and most people I know, and I had no choice in my mind except to resign.
Based on the research that I did throughout the year 2000 and that I'm still doing, I have not found that law. I've asked Congress, we've asked a lot of people in the IRS commissioners, helpers. They can't answer, because if they answer, the American people are going to know that this whole thing is a fraud.
I haven't filed an federal income tax return since I left.
I have not filed a tax return since 1999.
The income tax is nothing less than the enslavement of the entire country.
We'll take care of you and give you a security blanket from the cradle to the grave. We'll give you employment if you're unemployed. We'll give you welfare and security. All we want in return is all of your labor for all of your life. Or didn't you read those 732 pages of the 1935 Social Security Act before you signed the application? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the entire text of the contract is in writing. It's always been available. And any judge will look at you and say, why didn't you read the contract then, if you're unhappy with the results now? And you might say, well, I didn't know anything about the Social Security Act of 1935. Nobody presented the contract to me, and that's true. That's because it's called an adhesion contract. All you didn't hear of adhesion contracts in public school? By the way, who operates those public schools, ladies and gentlemen? Isn't it the government? And who operates Social Security, ladies and gentlemen? Isn't it the government? Would your government want you to know the answer to the riddle if you knew that you were worth $435,000 over the course of your life? Can you understand why government doesn't want you to understand the Social Security Act? Now, the IRS Form 1040 comes into play right along this line also, and it is in the nature of an installment note, yearly payable upon continued exercise of the franchise and its derivative of the law merchant. And among other things, this is why the IRS manual in the Legal Reference Guide at page 58, section 11 states, quote, "In any case not provided for in this Act, 26 U.S.C., the law merchant shall govern." All states have adopted this in their uniform business and commercial codes. And you'll see this in the California Civil Code in 3439.11, the UCC 1-103 of Arkansas Uniform Commercial Code, 85-1-103, Washington Revised Code 62A 1-103. Every state in the Union has such a provision. The government uses the power of attorney that was granted with the signing of the Social Security contract when they seek a redress of grievance. This is revealed in 26 U.S.C. 3101A. You might want to write that in your notes. 26 U.S.C. 3101A. It's the connecting link with Title 42, the section on the 1935 Social Security Act, Title II and Title 11. In other words, law is written line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. It's the methodology whereby we keep you perpetually deceived because, first of all, you've never been trained in law, and secondly, those that are trained in law would have to be trained in legal research to ferret out the connecting links to tie the jurisdiction of Title 26 and the income tax to Title 42 with Social Security. The average mind simply cannot cope with such a system. Even trained legal minds have a hard time coping with such a system. 3101A of the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, called FICA, where it says, quote, "Old age, survivors, and disability insurance, in addition to other taxes." What other taxes do you think they're referring to? It's called withholding. "There is hereby imposed on the income of every individual a tax equal to the following percentages of the wages as defined in Section 3121A, received by him with respect to employment as defined in Section 3121B. But the bottom line to that is this. Without a Social Security account, you can't pay an income tax because you're not a taxpayer. The Social Security Act is the contract whereby you gave your power of attorney to the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. It was under that power of attorney that you gave him the authority to tax you under the Income Tax Act of 26 U.S.C. Now, the connecting link has to do with money. It doesn't have to do with the Social Security Act of and by itself or the Income Tax Act, because there was an income tax in the United States during the Civil War. In fact, the first income tax passed in the United States was passed by New York State in 1778, a little known fact of our historical past. And of course, the concept of a central bank with a regulated monetary system appealed to the masses of people, because along with this came promises. That is, we'll tax the corporations, and when they pay the tax, you won't have to. And so there was a little element of greed. A little lust and greed was thrown out upon the waters, and people said, well, now that's a pretty good idea. Well, when the income tax was enacted with the Federal Reserve Act, I want you to notice that income tax and paper money came together in the same act. Because there's an old common law statute that says you shall not have an unjust weight or balance in your bag. It's against the law to deal in paper. So when the Federal Reserve came in to offer us paper, there had to be a methodology by which they could tax the paper out of circulation. Otherwise, you have a runaway inflation, which occurred in Germany in 1923. Notice that when the tax was first enacted, it only affected corporations, and the corporations paid approximately 1%. That is, you didn't pay any tax on incomes of $5,000 or less. And from $5,000 to $100,000, it was only 1%. And from $100,000 up, it gradually progressed upward, so that the average person making $5 a day in the Ford factory in 1913, which was $800 a year, wasn't even affected. By today's standards, you'd have to have a tax exemption of $240,000 in order to come around to the same standards that were applied to your great-grandfather in 1913. Now, the Social Security account number came into play in 1935. Between 1913 and 35, there was no tax on you and I. The wage earner working at the Todd shipyards had no fear of having his income taxed. In fact, between 1935, when the tax was enacted upon individuals under the Social Security regime, until 1943, you didn't pay a tax. The tax was first applied to individuals under the Victory Tax Act of 1943 and then was repealed in 1945 pursuant to the constitutional mandate that a direct tax can only be applied for 2 years during time of war. Well, the first man that I ever heard of that picked up on the fraud was A.J. Porth, who in 1944 was a business rep for a labor union. And he noticed that when the Victory Tax Act was repealed, the income tax took its place. And his first question was, where did this power come from? And the answer is, it came from the Social Security Act, which had been enacted 9 years previously and was sold by Arthur Altmeyer Jr., the first commissioner of Social Security, as being an insurance policy. Well, it isn't an insurance policy. It's called by the Supreme Court a welfare scheme. It is called social insurance, but it has no property rights. And it's the first premium of a tontine wagering policy, of which it is a double indemnity policy, and the tax would more rightly be called a premium. You know, when you pay Mutual of Omaha, you don't call it a tax, do you? But for some reason, when you pay your Social Security premium, it's called a tax. Well, the income tax in reality isn't a tax. It's the other half of the premium. Let's take a look at what the courts have determined over the years. The Social Security account number is a grant of extra common law limited liability franchise, upon which benefits and costs, which are called an excise tax, may be levied. It is a license required by the state from individuals before they can be hired by corporations. Corporations are creatures of the state. These state-created corporate franchise employment is extra common law and can therefore, in addition, be indirectly excise taxed as an additional franchise. Now, what we learned from that is working for Mutual of Omaha, General Electric, or Bendix is a privilege. You have no common law right to work for a corporation or for a state government. It's a franchise, it's a privilege, and an excise tax is called a privilege tax. Secondly, the Social Security account number is a congressional grant of grace. It is a grant of franchise of right in the nature of that described in the class of cases represented by New Colonial versus Halvering, cited at 292 U.S. 435, and introduces us now to corporate law, which in ancient times was called the Roman law merchants, which has its origins clear back to the Tower of Babel, but more recently, about 945 BC on the island of Rhodes, and progressed through the Middle East and was last codified by the Hanseatic League of Germany. And it was called the Hanseatic League of Merchants, of which the East India Tea Company was one of the members. Today, in your state, you call it the Uniform Commercial Code. Underlying this corporate law is a more important body of law, which is called the Law of Corporations, or the Uniform Commercial Code. Corporations are juristic state-created persons. Under corporate law, the creator, the state, of these corporations may demand anything that it prefers from its creature within constitutional bounds, and it may regulate it in any manner whatsoever. Shockingly, the state may destroy or create a person, then regulate it by taxation, or can even destroy it by use of taxation. See Enoch versus Williams and VZ Bank versus Fenno, both cited at Enoch versus Williams.